So about a month ago, Cardfight made a very interesting video talking about the potential new aesthetics that could come in Cardfight Vanguard Overdress with the whole new nation system. And at the time I commented on the video about something I would love to see in Vanguard. But ever since that video, I've been thinking about this subject, and now I have a couple of ideas which I would really like to see in Vanguard. So with that said, I want to do a part 2 to that video, but with a time leap twist. Stand up, Vanguard! Ever since the beginning of Vanguard, we are very familiar with how Bushiroad creates their clans and how they create different aesthetics and mechanics according to their clan system. And Vanguard always have been very good at creating mechanics and aesthetics that fit to their whole design of their respective clans. They really feel like they belong to their respective decks. But the main issue is that Vanguard had a problem that it was confined to their 24 clan system, disregarding the extra clans that come in and out of the game. And because of that, it forced Bushiroad's hand to develop only 24 aesthetics and the mechanics that fit to those very specific aesthetic. But with the demolishment of the clan system and going for a more broader aspect with the nation system, it opens up the floodgates for very interesting aesthetic designs as well as card mechanic designs that we would never have seen in the days before Overdress. And we already see this in the first booster set as well as the starter deck with the introduction of the new police girls for Brand Gate and the new alchemagic mechanic for Stoicheia. So today I want to discuss about different aesthetics and mechanics they could explore in Overdress that I personally would love to see in Vanguard that now possibly could be doable. And we're gonna begin off with a couple pure aesthetic wise archetypes. And the first archetype is something that has been asked for by the community to some extent, especially in the last couple of years, and that has been around the fact that people want to see a more aggressive type of Angel Feather deck. An Angel Feather playstyle that isn't really about just healing and stalling the game, but be more aggressive out of it. And one aesthetic that I would always love to see in Vanguard that wasn't really doable as of yet, but now with Cater Sanctuary being a thing, it is definitely a possibility in the future. And that are Valkyries. Valkyries are basically aggressive warrior Angel Feather units. And with Royal Paladin and Gold Paladin now being combined with Angel Feathers, it's very much possible that we might see a Valkyrie archetype that also might utilize temples and chariots and just Pegasus units and knights that are all angel warriors at the same time, as it basically makes sense that Royal Paladin is now training Angel Feather units and suddenly those angels are now actually becoming warriors. And it wouldn't be the first time that we actually see Angel Feathers outside of their normal rules, because yes, we saw angel units in the Royal Paladin or in the Paladin clans themselves, Shadow Paladin, Royal Paladin and Gold Paladin, but we also saw them in Nova Grappler as a battle girl. And we have the Fallen Angels in Dark Irregular, so it wouldn't be that surprising if they might do a different approach for Angel Feathers, especially now they opened up the floodgates with Royal Paladin and Gold Paladin and the like. Now another aesthetic that I would love to see that we never actually saw in Vanguard before is a army style deck. And to explain what I mean with that, because yes, we have army based units or clans, like Aquaforce is basically the navy for Cray, we have Kagero, which is technically the air force of the world, and Tachikaze is the land troops, but Tachikaze is basically dinosaurs with artillery slapped to the back of them and calling a day. That is not really what I mean. What I mean is literally tanks, trucks, helicopters, jet fighters and all those likes, where we actually see the machines being printed on the card as the actual units. And you could take the direction that the names of the units and the actual units are the pilots piloting the machinery itself, so it's not necessarily the actual tank being the unit but the driver of the tank. Hence the name will probably be somewhere of a humanoid type of name. And it wouldn't be that unlikely to see something in Vanguard in that style, because we could go a more anime-esque approach with the art style as Digimon has it, for example. They have Digimons that are literally machines. They have literally tank Digimon or troop Digimons and all that kinds of jazz. They could take that approach, but they can also take the more realistic approach, especially as we're seeing Stoicheia units that look more gritty and mature. So it wouldn't be that far-fetched to actually see that type of design. And in what type of nation it could possibly play out, I think Brandgate will probably be the most fitting place for this, because Brandgate already has access to the giant robots of Nova Grappler and Dimension Police, and now with the Police Brigade with the new starter deck, I think it's basically a match made in heaven, because we have the lower end of the spectrum, just the policing officer side, and then the giant robot in the other spectrum. So just a normal land army, or just a normal army with land force and air force, whatever, is basically smack down the middle. So I wouldn't be surprised if they actually also have military equipment for the police girls to imprison their opponents. Also, right on time. Now, to round up the pure aesthetic type of archetypes I would love to see, my main number one aesthetic that I would love to see in Vanguard, and to be done in a specific way that only Bushiroad or Vanguard could do, is a ancient Egypt archetype. And basically what I'm referring to is like pharaohs, temples, symbols, the desert itself. A very good example of what I'm referring to is old Yu-Gi-Oh cards, where they have actually the pharaoh pictured on their cards, or where they have those mummified units or these relics, those ancient tombs. All that kind of jazz is something that I really like about card games and aesthetic wise, and it was the original reason why I was drawn to early Yu-Gi-Oh, as a lot of those cards were in that style. And I would really like that type of aesthetic to make its way into Vanguard, because I think the art style of Vanguard, they could really make some awesome cards in that theme, and it could make a very interesting, fun deck to play around. And if you think to yourself, this wouldn't fit in Vanguard one bit, well, there is actually a possibility that there is a region on Planet Cray that fits the criteria, because Dragon Empire is a gigantic landscape, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have some type of wasteland or a desert somewhere in the middle of that area that fits the bill for potential ancient Egyptian civilization. And if you think to yourself, well, if it's in Dragon Empire, how does that make sense to have a pharaoh and a human civilization? Well, Bushiroad could always take the MTG route and have a dragon being the pharaoh of the civilization itself, and just build it around that. Like they did it with Nicobolus. I don't see it. Why not? They couldn't do it for a descendant of Dragonic Overlord or something. Like, it's Bushiroad. They can make it happen if they want to. And honestly, I would really dig something like that. They create that in Vanguard, as it would make some banger artwork. As the fun thing about ancient Egyptian aesthetics, you can go all out. There are so many interesting things you could do with it. Like, just the civilization could be used, but you have also the mythology around the ancient Egyptian gods that they could utilize for the units. And maybe they can utilize the gods themselves as like the boss units for the archetype. Just throwing out some ideas there. And the ancient Egyptian aesthetic might be my number one new aesthetics that I would love to see in Vanguard. There are two more archetype ideas that I think I would love even more above that, but it's not because of their aesthetics, but mainly because of potential game mechanics they could bring to the game. And one of those things is something that I would like to call the Elemental Mage mechanic. And what this mechanic basically entices is that we have two sets of cards. We have our main units. These are just elemental mages themselves, and these can be from one of the main elements. We could have a fire mage, a water mage, earth mage, wind mage, electro mage. You could have those type of units. And then the second part is a spell book. And these are essentially order cards, and a different type of order cards called spell orders that you set aside at the beginning of the game. And let's say, for example, you have 10 spell orders in that archetype, so you have 10 spell orders to decide that is the same place as your G zone. You put them as an extra deck. And basically how this works is that your elemental mages interact with the spells that you play. So if you want to play a fire-based spell, you need to have a fire mage on the field. And if you want to do something like an electro spell, you need to have an electric mage. That's the basic core concept of it. But you can take this to a whole nother level depending on what type of direction they want to take with this, as they could make spells that change depending on what type of units you have on the field. So it might do something if you have a fire mage on the field. It might do something else if you have a water mage on the field. It could also be that certain spells become stronger if you meet certain criteria. So it maybe does something if you have one fire mage on the field, but it may do something more powerful if you have 3 fire mage and a water mage on the field, and you start to see that you need to build a specific field to facilitate those spell books and how you can activate those spells. That could mainly be around your main Vanguard, as the main Vanguard could have a mechanic like Alchemagic where it can activate one spell of your spell book per turn, for example. And you could go the route where the player can just cast a spell from the spellbook and they decide which spell, or you could go for a more fun route where the player either can only play the top card of the spellbook, and every time he uses a spell he needs to shuffle the spellbook, so the spells themselves are random, which means you could make the spells a lot stronger as they aren't as consistent, and then you can translate into the rearguard units, so the other elemental mages that support your main Vanguard. They could have skills that either can reduce the cost of the spells, or you could have those Oracle think tank like effects where you could check the top X amount of cards of the spellbook at the time and rearrange them to some degree, or maybe place a specific card at the top of the spellbook so you have more control over which spells you use. And the reason why I say an Oracle think tank effect is because I think that this type of archetype with mages and spells and that kind of stuff fits more in Cater Sanctuary, because not only do we have Royal Paladin, Gold Paladin, and Shadow Paladin, which literally have mages in them, like Luard is a dragon mage and has this whole cult around it, so I wouldn't be that surprised if there's some type of elemental magic schools in that nation as well. But Oracle think tank and Genesis also have some affinity with the divine, which might also translate into magic. Like Uranus with Genesis, yes, it's more astrology, but you cannot deny that there's at least some type of mojo juju going on by opening an astral plane and summoning a deity from a different realm. Like, there's some type of juice that Uranus is drinking that allows him to do that. At the very least, we can assume. So it might be a bit confusing how to envision this, but see it basically as your main pressure comes from this spellbook, and your units on the field dictate how strong those spells are or what type of spells you might get, and could interact with the spellbook itself, so you have some control over these type of spells. And to give an example of what type of spells we could see, we might have a fireball spell that shoots at an enemy unit, and instead of dealing a damage, because that would be a bit too strong, it might lower their power with 10k power, which basically means your opponent got hit by a spell, they are weakened by it, and that means your units are now, it's for them easier to hit the opponent's Vanguard. And to balance it out, I think the power of that archetype should come from the spells. The units themselves, the mages, should be weak units that don't get power buffs, whatever. Because mages usually are weak humanoids. They don't have a lot of physical prowess, so their main combo potential or their playstyle should come from the spells itself. And we could also have some kind of freeze spell, an ice magic spell that could freeze a unit shut like a pseudo lock, but because we don't have consistent access to those spells, one type of spell that could freeze a unit might not be overpowered. And at the same time, to balance it out, they could make a ruling that you could only have 2 copies of the same spell in your spellbook, or maybe only 1. But again, there are certain rules they should put in place to balance it out, and how they want to balance it out, that's for them to figure it out. This is just an idea that came in my mind that I like. Such a gameplay, I would actually be very fond of such a thing, because it's very different than the usual quota, and with them experimenting with something like Alchemagic, which is also something completely different than we ever saw, something like a spellbook type of mechanic might not be that far-fetched now. But I have one more thing that I want to talk about, one more potential archetype mechanic, and this one is actually very much doable and plausible, as Bushiroad to some extent already did this in the past. And what I'm referring to is a configuration and disassembly mechanic within Vanguard. I don't know really if there's a name for it. If there's a name for it, then let me know in the comments. I'm not too good with English to think of the name for it, but basically what I mean is an archetype which comprises of multiple units that can combine themselves together to create a bigger unit, but at the same time, on will, can disassemble themselves to return to these smaller units, and they can then reconfigure to a different unit, to a different robot. And to give a better, clear-cut example, we can take a look at the A to Z archetype for Konami's Yu-Gi-Oh! Because in Yu-Gi-Oh! We have that archetype, the A to Z archetype, which all comprises of units that are given a letter of the alphabet, and they can combine together to make bigger robots. But at the same time, they can also combine in different configurations to create different robots with different abilities. A good example is the XYZ units. These are all 3 different robots, but combined together they can create the XYZ dragon head cannon thing, like a giant cannon dragon. That's pretty strong. But at the same time, these 3 different units can also be combined in a different unit, because you can combine the XY together, the YZ together, and the XZ together to make different units in the process. So the archetype, mechanic, and aesthetics that I'm proposing are robotic units that can combine themselves together to a different unit whenever they want. How they can implement this is, again, a extra deck could be placed, like a G-Zone you could say, which have multiple end boss unit cards laid into them. Those are the unit robots that get where you build into, and then your main deck comprises out of these parts, which you can call to the field, and if you have all the parts together, you can combine them to a bigger robot. Now, they could go the route where the bigger robot will be placed on the Vanguard circle for a turn, or it could be placed on the regular circle as just a beater to the side, like a Valkyrian unit for Genesis. Either way, they can go that route, and probably they can make the main grade 3 have a keyword mechanic like we see with Zorga for Stoicheia, where that keyword or that mechanic allows the deck to function, because without that grade 3 you cannot perform the mechanic itself. But of course, it doesn't have to be necessarily a separate side deck or extra deck for the finishing robot. They could, of course, make it just main cards in the main deck, and then say that if you have the pieces on the field, you could superior call that unit to the field, or superior call it from the deck, drop some in your hand to make it a bit more consistent. And if you disassemble it, the card will maybe be bound or something else that you cannot do it over and over again. And that's very important. Yes, the main idea is that you can combine the units and then disassemble them whenever you want, but it should at least be that you can only assemble the units once a turn, to not be a bit too problematic if a lot of these giant robots have main phase abilities that could be abused. And speaking of main phase and potential extra things, they could then later make an upgrade to the archetype where you could multi-attack by attacking with the pieces and then allowed to assemble during the battle phase to then attack once again with the new giant robot, or the other way around, that you attack with the giant robot and then during the battle phase disassemble in the pieces and then attack again with the pieces themselves. Those could be very interesting ideas for that archetype in itself. But you might think to yourself, now hold on a moment, this doesn't really sound very Vanguard-ish to extent. Like, how would they do this, and why would they do this in the first place? Well, the answer to that potential remark is that Bushiroad already did this in the past. Super Dimensional Robo Dayusha is that card. That is that mechanic, because the Dayusha is comprised out of multiple different units, and even in the game itself they try to emulate this mechanic in the form of the Goyusha starter that allows you to put 4 dimensional robots into the soul to then superior ride a grade 3. And the idea was that you put in the specific key components that build Dayusha to then superior ride into Dayusha, because you build Dayusha, so to speak, in that play. And basically that would then be a entire archetype, and then instead of just generic cards that could be put in soul, it basically forces you to have specific parts, because those parts actually make the robot, and then depending on what type of main robot you want to go into, you can then put those key parts in your deck. And personally, that will make for some really interesting gameplay, as it really rewards good deck building, as you need to make a choice in what type of parts you want to play, what type of final robots you want to use, and of course, depending if you want to go for a side deck or an extra deck approach, then it opens up the deck building space even more, as you can focus on the parts themselves and have more flexibility in going in your main boss units or different boss units, as you could go into semi-transformed units and then in the big robots themselves. But at the same time, this archetype has endless possibilities, because they can always make a bigger robot, because the previous biggest robot can then combine with another unit to create an even bigger robot. So the possibilities are endless in such an archetype. And it definitely would make a really good homage to Dimension Police in the new Brent Gate Nation. But hey, those are just my ideas or my wishes for potential aesthetic archetypes within Vanguard Overdress. And if Bushiroad isn't going to use any of those, then at the very least, Bushiroad, give us a Steam Maiden archetype for Dark Stage, because I think that's the least you could do after the things you've done with Steam Maiden Melon during the V-Series. Can we at least say hashtag justice for Melon, and at the same time hashtag justice for Arlene, because we never got to see her in the V-Series. But hey, that's just me. But with that said, let me know in the comment section down below what type of aesthetics you would love to see in Overdress. What type of design approach do you think they could take and you personally would like them to take in Overdress? Could be just pure aesthetics, but can also be more mechanical wise, as the floodgates are open, especially now that we see the new Alchem Magic and the new keywords, as it really shows that Bushiroad is trying to do brand new things that they've never really done before in Vanguard. So the possibilities are literally endless. So let me know in the comment section below your ideas. And to give a reminder, there are definitely some obvious things that I didn't really talk about, because I explicitly didn't want to rehash the same information that Different Fight gave in his video, as he said as he talked about an ice-based archetype. And yes, I would love to see an ice-based archetype aesthetic as well, because we never saw that before in Vanguard. But again, he already explained it in his video, so I'm not gonna just say the same thing. I wanted this video to be basically an addition on top of his video with my personal takes on top of that. So with that explained, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Neep, and I see you guys in the next one!